Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this webinar, which has kindly been pulled together by one of our member organisations, Plenitude. Today, we're going to be looking at From Fines to Fixes, and it's a session that will be looking to provide compliance insights for crypto firms from recent enforcement actions. My name is Sue Carpenter. I'm the Executive Director at Crypto UK, and I'd like to thank the team at Plenitude for inviting me to step in and moderate this session today. Just before we get started, a few housekeeping points. We would be very open to take any questions throughout this session. Please do add any of those questions into the Q&A. We will go through these towards the end. I will pull out some of the relevant ones. We will hopefully put those in front of our panel and provide you with some more relevant insights and responses to those questions as well. The session is being recorded, and we will share a copy of the recording after the event with attendees and people who had registered. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the fantastic panel we have joining us today. To start with, I would like to step in and introduce Azaria Nukajam from Gemini. Azaria, would you just like to do a quick intro and just give people a bit of background on yourself?
Sure. Afternoon, Sue. Hello all. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm Azaria Nukajam, and I'm the head of regulation and compliance for Gemini's UK entities. For those of you not familiar with Gemini, we are a crypto asset exchange registered here in the UK, as well as an e-money institution. I have worked in financial regulation for 10 plus years, where I spent most of my career as a regulatory consultant in sort of traditional finance practice. I moved across into the payments, e-money, crypto space about 3 years ago, and I haven't looked back since.
Fantastic. Great to have you join us today, Azaria. Next on our panel is Tom Armstrong from TRM Labs. Tom, over to yourself.
Thanks so much, Sue. Thanks for Plenitude for putting this on. Hey, everyone, it's great to be here. I run TRM's compliance advisory function. TRM, if you're not familiar with it, is a blockchain intelligence company. So we provide intelligence, regulatory policy insights, as well as compliance tooling for AML compliance teams and people trying to build solutions in this space. I've been at TRM for almost 3 years. Time in crypto just runs a little bit differently. So it's been quite a journey, but my background is from traditional finance. I worked at Goldman Sachs in their financial crime compliance department for almost 10 years, ran a number of their investigative teams and started up their kind of first crypto compliance team within financial crime. And right now just spend a lot of my time working with banks, crypto exchanges, all the way down to even DeFi protocols, just trying to figure out what is best in class look like and how do we build programs in this space. And looking forward to the discussion today.
Fantastic. Welcome, Tom. And last but by no means least, and making up the last of our panelists, we have Manuel Fajardo from Plenitude Consulting. Manuel, would you like to make an introduction?
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, everyone. It's good to be here. So my name is Manuel Fajardo. I head the digital assets practice at Plenitude. For those of you that don't know, Plenitude is a niche consultancy specialized in financial crime topics and wider compliance. Been active for about 10 years with a large client base in the banking and TradFi sector, but we also have been very active in the recent years in the digital asset space, as well as e-money and payments. And as for my background, I have spent about 16 years in the traditional asset management sector, but discovered crypto for my own investments, about 8-9 years ago, got deep into the rabbit hole and eventually decided to bet my career on it. And, here I am. So advising either crypto firms on the joys of being regulated and compliance with regulator, but also TradFi firms on, how to adapt their control frameworks to crypto projects.
Excellent. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to have you all joining us today. I think there's going to be some really good insights and experience that you can share. Obviously, the session itself, we are going to be looking at some lessons that have been learned from recent enforcement and sharing some best practices around governance. I think it would be really good to kick off, hopefully to kind of get some insight and understand what the current situation looks like here in the UK. So, Azaria, I'm going to hand over to you first, just to give us a little bit of your view on what we are seeing from the regulators here in relation to enforcement trends and just some of the things that we think would be really helpful in terms of scene setting.
Sure, thanks, Sue. I'll base some of my commentary on personal experience and engagement with the FCA over the past number of years, but also on the reporting and publications that the FCA issues around enforcement data, enforcement trend analysis, etc. I think the FCA is very much still focused on its strategic objectives, which of course are in the main to protect consumers from harm, to protect the integrity of the financial systems, and to promote effective competition. I think on enforcement in particular, the FCA has been very vocal about the fact that it won't hesitate to use the full force of its powers to achieve impactful deterrence that is aligned with its strategic priorities. And for those of you in the room today that are meeting and speaking with the FCA on an ongoing basis, you will hear it say over and over again this phrase around using the full force of its powers. And when the FCA talks about its powers, it's really just referring to its ability to impose financial penalties, cancel a firm's authorization or registration, prohibit individuals from carrying out regulated activities, issuing public censures, prosecution action, amongst other things. And in the last few years, I think, at least from my view, it's been very interesting to see the shift in the way the FCA uses its powers to take actions against firms. We're sort of moving away from a firm failing equals direct enforcement approach and more towards the use of early intervention and supervisory tools such as VRECs, IRECs, remediation requests, Section 166 skilled person reviews, which for those not familiar with that terminology, it's just another form of outsourced supervisory investigation. I think all of these tools help the FCA to continue to impose higher standards in practice, rather than kind of moving straight to enforcement and then often removing firms from the regulatory environment, which I think is good for the industry on the whole. In terms of the key trends, at least from the past kind of 2 to 3 years of enforcement data, I think at a high level, we are certainly seeing a downward trend in enforcement action. And just to give you some statistics around that, in the year 23-24, the FCA issued 12 fines, 8 against firms and 4 against individuals. I think this is compared to about 24 in the year 2022-2023, in which 15 firms were fined and action was taken against 9 individuals. And I think at the same time, we saw a decrease in what the FCA calls its operations, which is just a term that the FCA uses to describe scenarios in which it takes direct investigation against individuals, against firms, or against groups of regulated entities on the whole. And we saw that in 2023-24, its open operations amounted to, I think, a total of 25, which is down from 34 in 2022-2023. And in the most recent publication of the FCA's enforcement trends paper, it reported that as of 31st of March in 2024, it had 188 enforcement operations. And if we compare that to the year prior, it was 591 open enforcement cases. And I think with that in mind, we do, like, whilst we are seeing lower numbers of overall enforcement action, we are seeing an increase in the FCA's use of early intervention powers, such as VREC and IREC. And I know I touched on VREC just a moment ago, but for those of you who may not be familiar with that terminology, a VREC is a voluntary requirement, and it's a regulatory tool that's used by the FCA to address operational issues that could cause harm to consumers or to the financial system. And contrary to what the name might suggest, VRECs are very often not voluntary, and the FCA may then impose what we call an OREC or IREC, which is an own initiative requirement, where a firm does not want to voluntarily agree to the imposition of certain restrictions. And just a bit of a flavour on that, an example of a VREC could be that the FCA asks a firm to suspend the onboarding of specific groups of customers, or to cease to offer specific products and services for a period of time, whilst it addresses like areas of actual or potential harm that the FCA itself has identified. We have also seen an increase in skilled person reports, as I mentioned earlier. And then one that I think is particularly interesting from an FCA perspective is on the use of criminal prosecution powers. And interestingly, I think September last year was the first time the FCA brought a criminal prosecution relating to unregistered crypto asset activity under the MLRs. And in that case in particular, the charges were brought against an individual that was found to have been running a network of crypto ATMs in the UK. And then more generally, in terms of like themes across enforcement, we are seeing the same things persist. So the FCA is looking at governance. That's a really big area. They are looking at failures of systems and controls in relation to the likes of financial crime, market abuse, safeguarding, etc. But I think for the crypto asset sector more specifically, as we can sort of see from the FCA's recently published crypto roadmap, the sort of themes and areas that the FCA will be focusing on, in my view, will expand just beyond financial crime and governance, which is what we tend to see, tends to be the focus at the moment. So, for example, we can expect to see that the FCA wants strong compliance in relation to prudential risk management, to custody, conduct of business is another one that was called out in the roadmap, and it's very much looking like consumer duty will be a part of the agenda for the FCA under the full scope crypto authorization regime, and it calls out other areas like operational resilience. So I think this will be a time for firms, particularly compliance risks and senior management within crypto asset sectors, to start to think about how to prepare for these incoming very significant changes.
Thanks for that, Azaria. I think that's a really good comprehensive start in terms of where the UK is positioned. But I think it's also helpful to then understand where does that actually place the UK in terms of what we're seeing in other jurisdictions and what actions we're actually seeing in other countries. And I think for this, I'll come to you first, Manuel. I know you've got a really good overview kind of across France and across Europe, and then we'll come to yourself, Tom, and we'll look at sort of the US markets as well. So, Manuel, where are we comparatively to other markets?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because, you know, like I say that I have one leg in the UK and one leg in France, given our activity in both areas. And I think that, you know, I can definitely see, you know, what Azaria was talking about, you know, what the landscape in the UK. You know, at Plenitude, we are in the skilled person panel. And, you know, we have seen a significant uptick in skilled person reviews in sectors that are very close to crypto, like e-money and payment services. I call them adjacent sectors because, you know, there's a perception of these sectors being high risk and regulators work on a risk-based approach. And that's, you know, one thing that, you know, that leads me to think that, you know, in the UK, basically crypto is next, you know, like, you know, we have really seen, you know, that volume coming our way. And I have been leading a number of those reviews and, you know, they're very extensive. They focus on every aspect of the financial crime framework. There's always a governance component, etc. And I think that, you know, France is in a way, I mean, probably one step ahead in that enforcement road, in the sense that, you know, that France pretty much started a big round of reviews on the crypto asset sector last year. You know, when the ACPR, one of the French regulators, published their business plan for 2024, crypto was already singled out. And the plan for 2025 came out this year. And, you know, I have it in front of me. Basically, they say the authority will extend the implementation of its risk-based supervision approach in the area of AML and will deploy the supervision in the crypto assets and DeFi sector. And so basically, you know, we're expecting a continuation of that. You know, we know from discussions with, you know, clients in France or the French Trade Association that a number of crypto companies have been visited last year, and we can only expect that to continue because, you know, it's the only sector that has been singled out in their business plan. So, you know, I think that, you know, that's kind of a shape of things to come in the UK as well. Basically, we can expect definitely more scrutiny.
Fantastic. Thanks, Manuel. And Tom, I'll hand over to you. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of talk of what's happening in the US markets at the moment, but it'd be great to understand sort of where comparatively they are at the moment.
Yeah, the US political scene's really boring right now. There's nothing interesting going on at all. No, in all seriousness, you know, the US has always had its own kind of particular approach to enforcement on the, you know, when it comes to, you know, penalties and fines and that type of thing. But I think the most interesting thing on the US side is not necessarily that we've had this kind of complete sea change of pro crypto momentum almost overnight. right? But that it's been across all these different facets of things that I think really heavily impact compliance and enforcement. And so, at the top, you have sentiment from the White House that is, again, not only clearly pro-innovation and pro-crypto, but wants to enact legislation very, very quickly to see that agenda kind of come to fruition. I was in a conference last week where policymakers were saying, they're trying to get a stablecoin bill passed within the next month or two, very quickly, through Congress, followed by a market structure bill, which would kind of hopefully get regulatory clarity across, what's security and get some of those issues out of the way. And so you'd have, that clarity you need to kind of start scaling crypto operations within the US. But then, even more interesting is you've got these key appointments in cabinet positions and across all regulatory agencies. We've seen a real kind of reshuffling of these key regulatory leadership positions, most notably, Treasury Secretary, but also new commissioners at the SEC, CFTC, right? Chairman Gensler has moved on. His regime is kind of over. There's a report just over the weekend that I read that the acting head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had told all staff to pause examination and supervision activity. And that was a body that had lots of interactions with crypto entities. You saw people like Brian Armstrong come out after that news and was really kind of cheering that because they had so much regulatory scrutiny from that particular body. And then you've got kind of traditional banking institutions who have largely been waiting on the sidelines to do anything meaningful, at least in the US, in the crypto space, and now they're really ready to jump in. They may move slowly at first, but it's going to accelerate quickly. And so, you've got all that kind of confluence of things that are happening from the political side. If that weren't enough, then you've also got things like the creator of the Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht, who was pardoned. You have appellate courts who are looking at potentially ruling that some of the Tornado Cash smart contracts can't be sanctioned by OFAC. So you have all these facets coming into alignment that suggest there may be a real loosening of crypto enforcement actions and regulatory pressure. And yet, in the US, there's already been over $500 million in penalties related to crypto firms just in 2025, right? And some of those cases were already working their way through the system and are now just settling. So you had, I think it was $100 million settlement against BitMEX, $300 million settlement for KuCoin. You also have state regulators who are starting to be much more influential in this space. And so if you're a global kind of crypto firm, you're looking to do business in the US, and you want access to two of the United States' biggest markets, which is New York and California. Well, New York already has the BitLicense regime, and the New York Department of Financial Services is a very sophisticated regulator in this space. They are not easy to just kind of, they don't rubber stamp license applications or that type of thing. And so there's still a lot of scrutiny from that perspective. And then later this year, you're also going to have California. They have a department that's coming out with basically an equivalent of the New York BitLicense. And so again, you will not be able to access the two biggest markets in the US without going through this kind of heavily scrutinized process of license applications. And so my guess is that regulators, excuse me, and law enforcement are probably going to be very selective about where they look to apply pressure and bring enforcement cases. But by no means do I think that we're kind of headed for a laissez-faire approach out of the US.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that's really helpful to put it into more of a global context as well. Just a reminder for anybody on the call, please do feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A section here. We will come back to those towards the end as well. I think it's really helpful now to move on and maybe dig down a little bit more into the detail as well. So Azaria, I'm going to come back to you first. Just in terms of really kind of understanding where we've seen enforcement action and any specific examples and case studies, just to help illustrate some of the points that we've touched upon here as well.
Yeah, sure. When I was thinking about case studies and examples, the two that came to mind immediately, the recent enforcement action against Starling Bank and CBPL, CBPL being an affiliate of the Coinbase Group. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on CBPL because I think it really kind of underscores that shift in regulatory approach, regulatory enforcement approach rather, given the nature of the actual fine. What's also interesting to me about this decision is that firstly, it's the first crypto-related enforcement action, which of course, very kind of relevant for our sector. It's also the first time that the FCA has taken enforcement action under the electronic money regulations to which the firm at the time was subject. And then finally, as we'll come to see in just a moment, and as is a reason that I find this to be particularly important and interesting, is that CBPL actually received a fine for failure to comply with the requirements under a VRAC. And that really emphasizes that kind of shift in approach from the FCA of giving firms an opportunity to put things right before then kind of utilizing enforcement as an action of final resort. And I think historically we see the FCA issue fines for like on the basis of breaches of specific FCA handbook requirements, or for example, more systemic failures to implement adequate systems and controls, which then subsequently result in the breach of an FCA high-level kind of principles for businesses. But this case study, I think, just supports the trends that we are seeing in terms of the FCA holding firms to higher standards initially, giving them the opportunity to work together to put things right, and then enforcement coming in right at the end. I'll touch on the business model utilised here briefly, and then we can look at the sort of facts and the FCA's concluding findings. And for CBPL, CB Payments Limited, up until recently, it was regulated under the electronic money regulations here in the UK, but the firm has now in the past, I think, month or so, received its VASC registration, which essentially now allows it to offer both crypto and fiat in the UK. But at the time of the decision notice, it did not undertake crypto asset transactions itself. It just acted as a sort of facilitator or gateway for customers to trade crypto assets via other entities within the Coinbase group. And of course, this model is not dissimilar to the models of our competitors and kind of key players within the sector. Interesting, but for this particular case, as is the case with much of the FCA's enforcement, the work or the review, the investigations began some years back, and actually it started with an FCA visit back in 2020 as part of its normal supervisory activities, and following a deep dive review into the firm, the FCA identified a variety of weaknesses around the firm's financial crime control framework, and there was a back and forth for a period of time. There was this negotiation and kind of proactive engagement to arrive at a solution that would work, that would satisfy the FCA and also work well for the firm. And so at the time, back then, it was agreed that CBPL would enter into a voluntary agreement or voluntary requirement, which specifically imposed a mandatory prevention of the onboarding of high-risk customers, whilst CBPL committed to and undertook a variety of different actions to improve its financial crime framework. And in order to deliver this VRAC, both CBPL and the FCA agreed a definition for what high-risk customers would be, and then CBPL was required to kind of update its automated onboarding systems and controls to ensure that that profile of customers ceased to be onboarded during the period of remediation. And despite various commitments and notices to the FCA that the VRAC had been fully implemented, the FCA found that there was a period of about 3 years dating across October 2020 to October 2023, where CBPL had onboarded and provided paper money services to the specific restricted customer profile, I think totaling a number of about 13,000 high-risk customers. And the FCA also found that about 30% of those customers had made prohibited deposits worth a value of about $25 million US, and eventually during the period of trade or business, SARS, excuse me, SARs were eventually filed by the firm, and those SARs were filed in respect of a total of 60-odd customers. And the FCA found that for each of those customers onboarded and each of the deposits and transactions performed, they constituted to a separate breach of the firm's voluntary undertaking or voluntary requirement, which in the FCA's view was the breach itself in nature was very, very extensive. So as a result of these breaches, the FCA considered that CBPL had breached its principle to obligation by failing to exercise due skill, care and diligence in relation to the design and the implementation of that compliance framework to adhere to the VREC, and the FCA found that it had also failed in the implementation of adequate monitoring and adequate kind of systems and controls. And before I go into the FCA's specific finding, just to pause for a moment to underscore here the importance of firstly actually complying with direction or requirement or remediation or any other sort of commitment that a firm makes or agrees with the FCA. It's really important if you are going to enter into VREC, do comply. And I think the other thing that was interesting that I took from this was just this need to keep the FCA informed of progress, the need to document every aspect of remediation, every action that is being taken, and also flag in a timely manner where things aren't necessarily going to plan, identify the root cause of those issues, and then share any actions that the firm will take to address the issue with the FCA. This period of time, I feel, this period of time where the FCA might impose a VREC or an IREC, etc., serves as a grace period, and I don't think it should be taken for granted. I think it really presents an opportunity for a firm to demonstrate that it's taking compliance with its regulatory obligations seriously. And I think one other thing that stood out to me was just like ensuring the importance of ensuring that adequate resources are deployed towards the development and implementation of any sort of robust compliance framework. I think as someone who does work in the sort of regulatory and compliance sector, we can often try to do it all alone. And I think there is room for and scope for seeking external advice and expertise, as well as seeking input directly from the FCA where necessary, or where there is any sort of misunderstanding or kind of lack of clarity around what the FCA expects. So in terms of the key findings of this particular decision, then the FCA said that CBPL had failed to maintain adequate records of all the steps that it was taking to ensure compliance with the VREC. It said that the pre-implementation testing was inadequate, and that CBPL failed to ensure that the engineers that were implementing the changes to restrict the high-risk customers hadn't been given with the full instructions on how to implement those controls compliantly. The FCA also pointed that post-implementation monitoring was inadequate, and that CBPL failed to undertake a formal review of the overall effectiveness of its compliance framework for the VREC across a period of over 2 years. And so for me, this is a 40-page decision notice, a lot of good detail in there about what those restrictions were. But for me, I think this case study really highlighted the need for robust governance and oversight and input, by senior management, where they are making key decisions, ensuring that they understand those decisions, how it affects the business from a risk appetite perspective, and how it affects the business from an overall regulatory risk exposure standpoint. I also can't highlight enough the importance of developing a compliance framework that is fit for purpose. I think Manuel touched earlier on this idea of a risk-based approach, and it's something we hear often within the compliance space. The framework that you implement needs to follow a risk-based approach, needs to be fit for purpose, and needs to serve work to address any kind of risks to which the business is exposed to. And from a financial crime perspective, I think identifying and assessing key risks on an initial and an ongoing basis is fundamental, as well as doing the ongoing monitoring, just to ensure that any controls that you implement remain effective and remain fit for purpose, making adjustments as required, and just ensuring that there is someone within the business that is accountable for all those decisions, and the rationale, the basis by which those specific decisions would have been reached. So I think that was a very interesting approach the FCA took here, and it really highlights that the FCA will give you a chance, firms, not you, but firms, regulated, registered firms, a chance to fix issues that might be causing more systemic harm, and where it fails to do so or doesn't do so to the standard that the FCA would expect, it would then pursue enforcement as a sort of final action.
Fantastic. And I think there was so many takeouts from there, as you say, it's a fairly long and lengthy report that came out from the FCA. But I think even though that seemed to touch upon so many different areas in terms of the enforcement actions that have been taken, I think, Manuel, I know you've got a good example, a couple of good examples actually of other areas as well that have fallen down. And I know, Tom, you have too. So I'll come to you guys next. And I think, Manuel, if you could share your example, because I think, again, it just highlights some other points and considerations.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that, this one was focused on onboarding, and I think that, the case studies that, that most come to mind in my case, and I'll give you two for the price of one, because they're just so close. And it's, again, my moving between the UK and France to cover this. One of them is Bread. It's a mid-sized French bank who got fined 2.5 million last year for transaction monitoring failures, essentially, and some SAR reports, suspicious activity reporting failures. And the other one is Metro Bank, which is a mid-sized UK bank, who got fined 16 million over transaction monitoring failures. And that's the reason why I want to bring them two together, because it kind of conveys how the principles that apply to banks, to crypto firms, to payment services firms are essentially the same. And basically the lessons that we have learned, whether it's a case in the UK or a case in France, apply to all of our industry, again, irrespective of our jurisdiction, because we have to remember that the principles that apply to financial crime are pretty much universal. A lot of this comes from Gafi, so all of these lessons are very transferable. So I think that when it comes to transaction monitoring, you have four key things that are essential in a program. One is the setup of the rules. Basically, if you're using transaction monitoring, you have to make sure that your rules are fit for purpose. And this is something that the French case brought in detail. The ACPR went in detail through their scenarios and said, look, your scenario doesn't make sense because you're using very wide segments, because you have very high thresholds. So, for example, I can give you a blatant example. Customers without revenue wouldn't trigger any alerts for 50K transactions in a period of a month. How does that make sense for somebody that doesn't have revenue, for example? So, so it was basically castigating the firm for saying, your scenario doesn't make sense. This threshold doesn't make sense. This is not triggering any alerts. This is not related to your risks. Then there's the topic of data quality. Again, in the French case, they realized how, a lot of the customers, they didn't have revenue data. They didn't have activity data, or it was very old. In the UK case, in the Metro Bank case, a lot of the data was there, but was simply not being fed to the system. When they were feeding the data to the system was rejecting it. It was going to a bad data folder and languishing there forever, literally for 3 or 4 years until they picked them up, for example. Or many of the accounts, for example, had been excluded from the scope that was being monitored. So they were missing literally millions of transactions, for example. Then there's the question, you have the rules, you have the data, you get the alerts. And in the French case, one of the big comments was the quality of the investigation of the alerts. Basically, a lot of the alerts were being closed with just, okay, nothing to see here, normal, without anything into the thought process that went into closing an alert. So the regulator, again, blame them for that, because that's not the way that it's expected to be. And then, one topic that, again, links together everything that we've been talking about is governance. Basically, either in the French case or in the UK case, there was an inadequate MI to see, for example, okay, is the data being fed? Are we getting data rejected? Do we have missing data fields? Do we have backlogs of activity creating? And even when there was data, or when there was, for example, some issues that were brought up by external consultants or by internal audits, the issues were never addressed. So you had a big governance failure, because people knew that there were issues with the quality of the investigations or the quality of the data, and they were never acted upon. So basically, you have kind of those four components, and you have those big parallels between the UK and the French bank, which are completely transferable for crypto, whether you're talking fiat monitoring or crypto monitoring. Because one thing that is an easy temptation is, okay, I'm using automated monitoring. I'm using out-of-the-box settings that came in the tool that I'm using. But then you need to be able to stand by the rule sets and say, why does this rule set make sense for me? Why did I choose these thresholds and not that one? How am I making sure that that the thresholds that I use are continuously adapted to the characteristics of my customers? I'll leave it there because we have lots of ground to cover, but I thought that was a very interesting one.
No, it was, Manuel, and I think you touched upon governance there as well. And I think, Tom, the example that you got really kind of stretches into that a little bit further as well. So it'd be great just to kind of get some context from you on the case studies and examples that you have.
Yeah, I love so many things that Manuel and Azaria said in theirs. I think there's really consistent themes here, which is interesting to see. Yeah, I think we have to talk about the TD Bank enforcement action. Not only because it was one of the largest fines in the history of AML enforcement actions. There's also crypto connections, which are super interesting to kind of unpack, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I think the themes here, the AML program deficiencies, it's one of the most kind of practical, granular enforcement actions I've ever read. Everything from, as you say, Sue, the governance structure, who reported to who, how the teams were constructed, all the way down to some of the themes that Manuel was just talking about from a transaction monitoring perspective. And I think the other thing, this enforcement action, it just really shows the weight and might of what enforcement actions can look like, where there's a strong US nexus that brings kind of those regulators into your purview, right? This is a $3 billion penalty, a 4-year monitorship, a criminal guilty plea, blocked acquisitions, asset caps on your balance sheet, right? It doesn't get much more punitive than this one. And very similar to what Azaria was saying, like this was also an example where there's, despite the US's reputation for being heavy on the enforcement side, there's always notice, right? That always starts with, an examination or a single case that, causes concern. And as Azaria said, if you don't remediate, this is kind of the trajectory that it goes on. So just to unpack a few kind of key themes from the consent order from TD, we can start with some of the crypto connected activity. And what you essentially had in this case were TD Bank customers who, when they were onboarded, disclosed in their KYC onboarding forms that they worked in a real estate business, or I think it said sales finance. I don't know what that means. Someone can say in the comments what that means. But they said in the onboarding forms that they would have minimal wire activity that wouldn't exceed $25,000 or something annually, and that their annual sales from their business, Manuel kind of touched on this as well, was $1 million, right? And what transpired with this group of customers was that they conducted over $1 billion in transactions through TD, in and out of these accounts. 90% of the incoming funds were coming from a UK-based crypto exchange that isn't named in the action. And more than 60% were outgoing transactions that went to a Colombian institution that offered crypto-related services as well. There were some other jurisdictions that were in that mix, but in that 9-month period, right, you have $1 billion, which is 100x of what this account kind of discloses at onboarding of what they say they're going to do. Really clear signal that this is laundered proceeds. And the regulator essentially called out, a few different typologies of what you could monitor for just from this example. But the most interesting to me is around what we call kind of expected activity. Do you monitor your customers' behavior against their expected activity? And it's one of the more kind of prominent regulatory trends that I've seen take shape in the last couple of years. Definitely on the banking side. I think it's also kind of coming for crypto firms. And it's really hard to, it's not the easiest kind of set of surveillance tools to build, because it really relies on, well, how much data are you collecting at the onboarding stage so that you have enough to actually monitor against, right? It's really tricky. Another theme is transaction monitoring backlogs. So it's not uncommon at your institution to have, periods of spikes and, ebbs and flows in transactions. And so you may kind of run backlogs from time to time. It's also not uncommon to outsource those backlogs to contract workers, which was what TD Bank did. This was also mentioned in the Coinbase New York Department of Financial Services enforcement action from a year or two or so ago. And one of the things that FinCEN called out was they weren't, with two things. One, they weren't effective at reducing the backlog quickly, right? So they had a strategy, I think they put it in quotes, that said gradually reduce the backlog. but it wasn't fast enough. It took like over a year, I think, or so in some cases, and that just wasn't fast enough for FinCEN. And there were reports that TD Bank employees said that the contractors who they had, outsourced the work to were, quote, subpar, shoddy, incompetent. If you don't think that regulators will ever pull your emails or internal messages, you're most likely wrong. Those kind of messages all the time get pulled into enforcement actions. And so, the BSA officer was essentially going to the board and senior management and saying, we've got this under control. It's fine. We have a plan in place. And the reality was just different there. There were a ton of other kind of transaction monitoring, very practical, detailed takeaways, through the action. But maybe the last one I'll just give is a discussion throughout the consent order around the culture of compliance at TD. And I think it's instructive to look at what did the regulator point to specifically show that they didn't have the right kind of culture and governance structure and that type of thing. And they looked at things like, well, how quickly do you make improvements once gaps were identified? If compliance raises their hand January 1st and says, hey, I think we've got an issue, and you don't fix it for years, well, the regulator's going to say you don't have the right org chart, you don't have the right resources, you don't have the right, culture. It was, tuning alert surveillances so they wouldn't have to hire more staff. It was they couldn't get the resources that they needed to remediate their program. They were effectively incentivized in this case to spend as little as possible in their compliance program. Those were all things that the regulator pointed to say, you've got a lot of bells and whistles that we see in a compliance program, but you don't have the right culture, you don't have the right organization, you don't have the right governance structure in place. And at the end of the day, I think culture sounds like this very, idealistic, theoretical term that doesn't hard to translate into like the realities of and just challenges that compliance teams face, but it's absolutely incumbent upon the compliance teams to build that culture over time in very real ways, and think, what can I do to kind of enhance the standing of our compliance team and department so that when these issues manifest, you have the resources, you have the support, you have the relationships to kind of do all the remediation that you need to do. So as again, bringing it full circle back to what Azaria said, when issues are identified, they're kind of remediated quickly, even if it's with a regulator and not ultimately flowing into what turns out to be a very large enforcement action.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think, we've spent a decent amount of time there really having a look through some really good and strong examples of where things haven't necessarily gone to plan. And I think that lends us quite nicely into the kind of flip side of that to go, well, actually, what can organisations do to protect themselves from falling into the same trap? And not just what can they do, but where can they actually find support resources available to be able to help them do that as well, and actually help to build the organisational structure to prevent these kind of enforcement actions. And before I just put that question out, again, just a reminder to anybody on the call, please do drop any questions into the Q&A. We will make some time here. I know there's been a lot of information to unpack, but I'm going to come back to you first, Azaria, just in terms of that practical guidance and advice for firms. So what do you suggest? What can you recommend, and how can firms help themselves?
Sure. What has worked well for me, and one thing I always recommend, is to use the information that is provided by your regulator, in this case the FCA. So work beyond the FCA handbook, look at good and poor practice guidance, look at supporting non-handbook guidance, keep an eye out for Dear CEO letters that are directed at specific sectors around what the FCA's key focus during that supervisory period will be and where its main concerns lie. Look to the industry, trade association involvement, and kind of just that general knowledge sharing amongst our peers, amongst ourselves. And I also think that senior management, in particular, the board, should really be brought in to this point around the fact that compliance is not for the compliance function. Compliance is for the whole business. And then there's something I think specific to business models within the crypto asset sector, is that often we see arrangements whereby operations, key functions are outsourced to group entities. Sometimes these group entities are based overseas, whether in the US or in mainland Europe or wherever they might be. I think one thing that's really important to underscore is the oversight of those outsourced activities. Firstly, to ensure that your service providers are operating in alignment with your UK specific policies and procedures and standards of practice, but also that they receive adequate training on those obligations and have a good appreciation of the UK specific regulatory culture and environment. Because sometimes where you have these shared service models or outsourced arrangements, there can be some friction around the way entities outside of the UK do things, or the way in which they perceive regulatory risk versus how we see it here on the ground in the UK. And then the final point, I think, is just around good record keeping. As I mentioned at the outset, we are seeing early intervention, and I think this means that in practice, the FCA will come knocking and they will want to see the evidence. And the FCA has also indicated that it's taking a more proactive approach to supervision of the crypto asset sector. So for many of us, we can expect the FCA to say, show me the evidence that you were complying with this or that obligation.
Great, thanks, Azaria. And Manuel, I mean, obviously this is what you do day in, day out, providing this kind of practical advice and support to firms. So the same question to you, where would you recommend people go to find these resources, and what should they be doing to protect themselves?
I think that, yes, exactly. The question about exploiting, the information that is available out there, whether it's enforcement notices, DRCO. I mean, one thing that we have seen in a lot of the requirements notices, for example, in the skilled person reviews, is that the DRCO letters in the UK get quoted, basically saying, the firm did an evidence action following the DRCO letters to this, so that's one thing. So use the information that regulators are giving. As we were saying in the presentation of this, also enforcement notices are a goldmine because they're very, very practical, they're very detailed. But I think that, I will just shift to, things that, that are part of the governance of firms. And I think that two key words are testing and documentation. I think that, something that we saw in Starlink, in CPBL, in Metro, in all of these cases, is that, a lot of times the issues were there for 3 or 4 years because there was no way of picking them. They were not reconciling the data that was fed to the system. They were not checking if the scope of people that needed to be screened against sanction list were being screened. They were not checking if they were screening against the correct list, for example. So having a discipline of testing your controls regularly is an essential part of any compliance program, because it's not just writing a pretty procedure, it's making sure that it's applied in practice, and and having that recurrent testing is one thing. The other one is documentation, basically, because and I think that especially in small firms, there tends to be kind of a temptation to say, there's just two of us, we sit across each other, we deal with things verbally, oh, I know that this is done this way, I know this, that, but that you're running a huge key person risk with that. And in the Metro Bank case, for example, they said that, like, nobody knew who was responsible for this topic because the person had left the company and nothing had been documented. And I think that, having clear procedures, having clear controls, having clear roles and responsibilities is extremely important. But all of this testing and documentation isn't useful if you don't act on the lessons. And I think that, that is also another recurring theme from a lot of enforcement actions is, when people raise issues, act on those issues. Because, again, sometimes it happens that internal audit knew, that junior staff knew, that external compliance consultants came and knew and told people, and just management sat on the issues. So it brings us back to the point that Azaria was making, senior management involvement, basically, like when somebody raises an alert, the process of governance means that, that whatever you learn from your data, from your controls, from your external audits, needs to feed back into improved controls. And basically you have kind of this cycle of feedback and continuous improvement. And that's the only way that, that you can basically evidence that you're doing something to improve your compliance framework.
Wonderful, thanks, Manuel. And Tom, I mean, over to yourself. I mean, you sit in a slightly different area within the ecosystem, so I guess you've got some slightly different views in terms of some of those recommendations as well, and some of the pitfalls that you've seen firms fall into.
Yeah, for sure. Different, but also, yeah, I couldn't echo more what Manuel and Azaria are saying. Just as an aside, one thing I think is so interesting is, I get asked a lot, and this was also true when I was at Goldman Sachs. What are regulators thinking? As if it's like you just can't guess what's on their mind and what they care about, and like it's a mystery. But as we're kind of saying, there is so much out there, and I'll just say from like a sanctions perspective, right? OFAC wrote a virtual currency guidance paper or guidance piece a couple of years ago that is exceptionally detailed about here's the 5 things that you need to show us that you have a successful, sanctions effective program. And so there are so many resources out there. It's not really that much of a guessing game in many cases. But yeah, just on the blockchain analytics side, as you think about, how these tools are used in surveillances across different crypto entities. One of the things I had a really interesting conversation with a regulator in another jurisdiction who said that they were concerned that institutions are starting to rely too much on just kind of the blockchain analytics tool itself without going through a lot more rigor. A lot of it is kind of what Manuel mentioned in terms of, how did you actually choose these settings and that type of thing, but also from a data side, right? Saying like, there's so much data that's not being used across a lot of the institutions that they regulate. And I've heard that theme from a lot of different regulators in a lot of different countries, that there's over reliance on just the tool itself and not really thinking more thoughtfully about what's all the data that's available to us and how do we use that, not only in just like transaction monitoring, but like where does it feed into the risk assessment, to customer risk rankings, and how does that all feed then into your transaction monitoring thresholds and that type of thing. I was on another webinar where someone else much smarter said, we're in a know your data regime. That's really the expectation right now, is that you have a real strong command of your data, your customer data, your transaction data, and you're really thoughtful about all the ways in which you use it. And the most kind of practical example of this is you think about just kind of indirect risk on the blockchain, right? So, most people are familiar with this idea that the blockchain enables you to have additional transparency into what your customers are doing, particularly if you're facilitating transactions on the blockchain, like an exchange or an OTC service or a payment processor or whatever it may be. And I find that there's a really wide range of ways that people are implementing indirect risk, all the way down to like, there's a large number of firms who don't use it at all. And so it's just a really tricky issue. But what is kind of coming to the forefront is regulators are getting much more attuned to the fact that there's this idea of indirect risk and are wanting really thoughtful answers as to how you're actually using it, whether you're using it, which cases do you not, or that type of thing, right? And so we just, encourage folks to really be thinking more than just, again, as Manuel said earlier, this isn't just kind of an out of the box tool that you set it and forget it and say that you're good from a monitoring perspective. You have to be so much more thoughtful now, I think, about all the data that's available to you and using as much as you can to kind of mitigate all the risks. And I think that's going to be one of those future regulatory expectations that people have.
Fantastic. And there was a couple of questions that I just wanted to come back to here, and I know we kind of want to have a bit of a wrap up just in terms of what the future looks like. But I think one that we kind of touched upon before, Tom, and something that's kind of come up again, it'd be really interesting just to get your viewpoint here on sort of where you feel that the current knowledge of the regulators is at and whether there have been any improvements. And I think you've touched upon some of these points as we've been going through the conversation, but I think it's a really critical area to pull out. And I think it does kind of overlap with some of the questions that we've been seeing as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the question, probably 2-3 years ago in a lot of jurisdictions was not whether to regulate crypto, but like, when is it going to go away? Maybe you'd have to go back a little bit further than 2 or 3 years, but now the question is very much not, whether, or it's just how we're going to do it. And so I've seen really an upskill very quickly over the last, call it 12 months or so, from regulators and just trying to get more attuned to this space. Everyone from the FCA to all the US regulators and a lot of regulators in the APAC region as well. And I think one of the most interesting trends that I see that I'm kind of keeping my eye on is this concept of real-time supervision. And it's the idea that, historically, when a regulator would come in and do an examination, they're doing a lot of sampling, right? Come in and, give us alerts from this time period to this time period, or, show us your policies and procedures and we'll look through them and that type of thing. And what blockchain analytics is enabling is not just kind of tools for compliance and sanctions and transaction monitoring, all that type of thing, but regulators are using these tools as well to say, hey, where can we be the most targeted possible, so that when we come into these examinations, we're not saying give us a sampling. Maybe they'll ask for a sampling as well, but they'll say, hey, on this date, you affected these transactions to this counterparty that we're not comfortable with. Can you explain it? And so this concept of real-time supervision and regulators using a lot of this data in their licensing, enforcement, and examination processes, I think is going to be a really interesting trend.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom.
I'll interject because, I think that
yes,
this
I
has
was
a
gonna
very
say, please
good
do,
link with
Steffi.
one of the questions in the QA actually, which is basically, like, as Tom said, like in the ACPR, for example, when I refer to their business plan for 2025, they explicitly said we're going to be using blockchain analytics tools, to inform our approach. So definitely, both sides of the channel, doing it. And, there's that question, in the chat about, those data requests that are coming from the FCA. We see the same in France. In France, there's a yearly questionnaire on AML, for example. And we think that, more than informing new rules, the idea is that, this data flowing to regulators is helping to build kind of the risk profile of the companies that they oversee. Sometimes the questions that we have been seeing are so detailed as to say, what is the threshold at which you consider a wallet risky when you screen it? How are you using the blockchain analytics? So, what scenario, like they tend to go into a lot of detail. And I think that, it goes on a par with this, upskilling of regulators, basically, a better grasp of the data, a better grasp of the possibilities that, that on-chain data gives them to ensure effective supervision. So I think we can definitely expect, higher standards on the side of the regulators because, they get, all the power that this data can give them.
And if I may add just one point around this upskilling of the regulator and improvement in its depth of knowledge, you also see this in the UK come through with the way and at the rate in which the FCA is authorising firms, particularly the MLR's registrations. You've seen an increase right at the outset, at the gateway of the standards that the FCA is expecting to see from a systems and controls perspective, from a governance and oversight perspective, and it's really leveraging its improved knowledge of the risks of the sector, the types of different models that operate within the sector to inform its approach to its approval of firms coming into the UK regulatory environment.
Fantastic. And I think just a good way to wrap things up, I'm very conscious that we're getting towards the end of time here. It would be great just to have sort of a minute just to wrap up from each of you in terms of where you think 2025 may take us, what your best guess predictions might be. Azaria, I'll hand over to you first. I'll let you get your crystal ball out.
Sure, I'll keep this very brief. I think I've touched on this several times now. Early intervention will continue, and as Manuel and Tom said, that the FCA rather will be looking to utilise data and analytics tools to take early action, and it now has all of these resources and materials at its disposal. So we can expect to see an increase in requests for information, whether it's Section 165s or informal sorts of requests, calls for input, etc. And then also I think we're likely to see an increase in kind of criminal law enforcement activity just in day-to-day practice. Tend to find that especially myself and our peers, we tend to see like reach outs from the police force, etc. And so I'm sure we are heading in that direction still.
Fantastic. And Tom, your predictions for the future?
Yeah, I would think that you may see less, and this is similar to what Azaria was saying, but you may see less kind of penalties and headline penalties this year. But yeah, I definitely think that the amount of regulatory interaction that you will likely have is going to increase significantly. And I'll just give you kind of one issue that I see on the horizon as well that will be really interesting is if it's true that regulators and enforcement bodies are going to be more targeted about who they actually choose to really apply pressure to and do enforcement activity with. The question to me, when they come in and do examinations at your firms, a lot of time will be, well, do you have interactions with those entities that we are enforcing penalties against? Russia's like a really interesting one, right? Where again, your institution may be fine from a compliance perspective, but do you have a lot of customer transactions with these other entities that we are targeting? And that may be an interesting issue that I think people will find in a lot of regulatory interactions this year.
Wonderful, thanks, Tom. And Manuel, finally, over to you. What else would you like to add in terms of where 2025 will take us?
I think we're very aligned. I think that, one thing is, the sanctions and the monetary fines are just the tip of the iceberg. And, you don't need to have a lot of those to know that there's most of the activity is happening under the radar. Most of the activity is happening, in a bilateral fashion between the firms and the regulators. And a lot of these things don't get to the stage of actions of monetary fines, but they still divert a lot of resources and a lot of attention. So even if you don't get more multi-million-dollar fines, the attention is definitely there. And I think that, that the crystal ball is definitely showing, more attention to our sector. I think that also, what Tom said, cross-border collaboration, the fact that, that our industry is such an international, so cross-border in nature, that means that, that the regulators are bound to cooperate and talk to each other. And I think that that's the reason why, we chose to basically have somebody in the UK, somebody in the US, somebody in France, because, those trends, as you hopefully have seen, are essentially the same, the principles are the same, and you can expect that the regulators are talking, because every time the regulators put a pronouncement, they're talking about cooperation between regulatory authorities, and yes, so all of this will translate in, in increased attention to us, and I think that this is not a drill.
Fantastic. Well, we will check in again this time next year and see how many of those predictions came true. But I would like to take the moment to just thank all of the panelists today. Azaria, Tom, Manuel, it's been really insightful. It's been fantastic that you've taken the time to share your knowledge, expertise and thoughts with everybody. Hopefully everybody on the call has found it useful. And again, thank you all for attending. Thank you all for participating. And Plenitude, thank you for organising this event. It's been fantastic working with you all. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.